Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on Chapter 9 Entering and Organizing Quantitative Data. So, a big part of research is the actual data analysis and how you get your data into a form that you can actually run statistical analyses out of. And I know that this is not a huge focus for our class, especially with the project, the research prospectus that you're writing. You're not actually collecting any data. So I don't want to spend a plethora of time on chapter 9, but I do want to present this information to y'all so that you have it should you want to engage in data collection as an actual researcher in the field doing this type of research. So I'm just going to do some broad overviews of how to enter and organize data. And again, remembering this is not a component of what you're going to be doing in this class, but it is important and helpful information to know so that you as a researcher or as a student have the resources available to you should you want to run those analyses. So to start very broadly, the purpose of entering and organizing data is almost sort of twofold. The first of that is that you are trying to place the results of your study into various categories where they belong. When you're trying to organize data, you're really trying to categorize it in meaningful ways that will allow you to make sense of the information that you've gathered from your participants. The other principle of organizing and entering data is that you're trying to remove or correct and fix any information that has the potential to intrude into the study or the analyses that you're running. By organizing and entering the data very meticulously, you're able to catch some of those errors that could influence the results of your study, and you really only notice them if you're the one sitting in front and doing the data entry yourself. So when you're doing data entry, the first step is organizing your data into readable and a meaningful format. So putting it in a way that makes sense for you. And I say this because it's important, but also it is incredibly time consuming to enter data. It's repetitive, but it's crucial because even the smallest mistake in entering data into a readable format can influence the results or the outcome of your study. So it's really important for you as a researcher when you're entering the data that you've gathered from surveys or from interviews with participants that you are putting it into a readable format. So whether that's an Excel document or a CSV file, whatever it is, you're putting it in a way that makes sense to you. And you're also taking a critical look at any of the survey questions before you even begin data entry so that you can save time and frustration. Make sure that things are grouped together logically, that they make sense. And with that, review the questions. Have a good idea of what questions need to come up. And from those questions, determine how the variables can be organized in the best way to ensure that your data analysis phase is simple and straightforward. So when you are putting data into an Excel document or some table format, you're grouping your questions or your data points together logically. You're putting all the cannabis questions together. You're putting all the identity or demographic variables together. You're putting all of the depression questions together. Whatever you're measuring, you're grouping them together logically so that when it comes time to run the analyses, you can select a wider range of columns and say, okay, run the analyses on these columns. The second step in really preparing data for entry is knowing what your survey package is, what your data analysis is going to be run, because data is going to be organized into a spreadsheet. And as researchers, we can enter our own data directly into different software programs to avoid any file corruption. There are various types of spreadsheet softwares that you can use. Some common ones include Excel, Statistical Packs for Social Sciences, which is SPSS. We also have the Statistical Analysis System, which is called SAS. There's Stata, R, MintJab, JMP, M+. All of those are software packages And some of those software packages will have their own form of data entry that you can use where you're manually putting in your data. And some of these software programs are better for analyzing results than they are for entering data. So, for example, R is okay for entering data, but SPSS is better. Excel is great at entering data, whereas Excel is not great at analyzing data, but things like M plus is fantastic at analyzing data. So, as a researcher, it's really important for you to analyze what you want for each software package that you're looking at. You want to critically analyze what weaknesses and strengths exist for each of the data packages that you're looking at before you ever start entering data. Because again, different programs have different strengths and different weaknesses, and as a researcher, you want to choose the one that makes the most sense for you. And when I say do research on this, like you can simply do an internet search and determine which type of spreadsheet is going to be the most easily imported into whatever software program you want to use. So a good example of this is if you don't want to do data entry in R because it's a little bit tedious, then you'll do a quick research and quick little Google search or internet search and see, okay, what format of files works well with R? And you're going to see that a CSV and an Excel file will work really well with R. Or maybe you're going to run your analyses in M+, and you need to figure out what format your file needs to be in because you can't use an Excel file with R or with M+. So just doing your research to know how your data entry file will match up with the program that you're going to use to run your analyses. Another key component of entering and organizing data is that you have to have a unique identification code for every one of your participants. As a researcher, you need to assign a unique identification number to every participant or every case in your study. And each complete questionnaire requires an identification number. And that identification number should be listed in the first column of your spreadsheet. Regardless of what software program you're going to use, that column should always be dedicated to your participant ID number. And then from that number, from that unique identification number that you have, and you get to create it. It can be some combination of your participants' initials. It can be just a short list of participant 1, 2, 3, so on until you get to the bottom of the list. It can be whatever you want it to be as long as you know what those codes mean. But once you have column 1 set as your identification code, every column after that will represent a variable. And the first variable will always be your identification number. So then after that, it's whatever you want. If you want to start with your demographic variables, if you want to start with one of your constructs of interest, each column will represent a new variable. And then each row of your spreadsheet will represent one participant or one case. So everyone's answers it will have every answer that one participant gave or one case person gave. So each column is a variable, each row is a participant. It's also common to recognize that you're likely going to have missing data when you are dealing with statistical analyses. It is really common for people to leave at least one question of a questionnaire unanswered. And as a researcher, we have to understand how we want to handle that missing data. Because missing information can be important in analyses by signaling an underlying problem with a specific question or maybe even a specific topic that question is ascertaining. So when you are recording missing information, you will have to research what type of handling you want to do with it. Some statistics programs are fine if you just leave a missing cell of a spreadsheet completely blank. So things like SPSS and R are really good. If you just leave it blank, it can handle that. Other programs aren't great at that. You need to actually convert it to a number. So, for example, M plus can't have any blank data, can't have any missing variables. So you have to preset the data set and replace all of the missing cells with a number that you can identify. So maybe negative 9999. And that gives you an indicator that that is a missing cell. And then you tell M plus this value equals missing, and then it can handle that information. So for you, you have to determine if you need it to be blank or if you need it to be some eye-catching specific number that's not included in your codes so that you can identify whether or not someone is missing information. There are also some key components of organizing and inputting variables, one of those being your coding and your code book. As a researcher, there are a number of minor decisions that you have to make before you can enter your data and begin analyzing it. And one of the first of them is coding them. So as a researcher, you have to determine how the responses to specific questions will be represented in the spreadsheet that you're going to be working from. And you do that by coding the information. And when we're talking about coding the information, you as a researcher are simplifying raw information in a way that's easier to analyze. So if you have a set of data, you might say, okay, I want my participants to write in their sex assigned at birth. And when you are putting in that information into a spreadsheet, instead of saying male, female, intersex, male, male, female, male, female, female, you might change your answers and say, okay, 1 equals female, 2 equals male, and 3 equals intersex. And then you convert it so that you can run analyses and say, okay, here's how many 1s we had, here's how many 2s we had, and here's how many 3s we had. So you're coding the information in a way that makes sense. And we do this for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons why we code information is because there are different types of variables that you're working with in data. One of the first of those is what we call categorical variables. And categorical variables are variables with answers that can be organized around various but often limited categories. There are two subsets of categorical variables, nominal and ordinal variables. So nominal variables are also called qualitative variables because they are variables that are mathematically related to each other, are not mathematically related to each other. They are simply variables that can be categorized. So nominal variables are one of two subtypes of categorical variables, and some examples of nominal variables are things like gender, race, religion, and other identity variables. So these categories of variables where one category is not better than the other and they're not at all mathematically related. Then you also have ordinal variables. And ordinal variables are the other type of categorical variable where responses do not have a numeric value, but instead represent an ordered sequence of responses. So a good example of ordinal variables are Likert type scales, where you are having someone rate strongly agree, somewhat disagree, and strongly disagree. And each one of those categories corresponds with a number. So strongly agree means 1, somewhat agree means 2, somewhat disagree is 3, and strongly disagree is 4. That's an example of an ordinal variable. And that's also an example of a Likert style variable, where you are having these sort of answer options that are associated with a number, but they don't actually represent the number that's being there. Rather, the number represents an ordered sequence from responses to responses. So that's the categorical variables. We also have numerical variables. And numerical variables are known as quantitative variables because they are expressed with numerical values in the original data. So some examples of numerical variables are things like age, income, and height, things that are represented by numbers. And Our data set must be consistent for analyzing information and determining how to represent every single variable in numerical fashion. And that's a fundamental part of coding, is getting our variables into a numerical fashion so that we can analyze it in a better way. There are two types of numerical variables: interval and ratio variables. Interval variables cannot express a ratio between numbers because of a lack of a true 0 point. So, an example of this is temperature. We don't have a true zero of temperature because there's never a complete absence of temperature. There's always a zero. There's always a temperature. Even if we say it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius, 0 degrees Kelvin, that still corresponds with a temperature. That's an example of an interval variable because there is no true zero. A ratio variable, on the other hand, has a true 0 point. So examples might be number of children that someone has. A variable that can be converted into a way that says, okay, there is a true zero where someone can say, I have 0 children, I have 0 height, I have 0 income, whatever it is. Those are all examples of ratio variables. And also, when you are putting information into a code book and into a data set, you need to have variable names that can be easily identified, because when you are getting into coding, it can be really easy to confuse one variable with the variable that's right next to it. So there are a few best practices for naming variables in a data set to ensure that the spreadsheet that you're working with is compatible with various analytical software packages. So in general, you want to make sure that the names that you pick are typically letters from the alphabet, and you're avoiding all special symbols or characters, because some statistical analyses programs, software programs, can't work with special characters in the variable names. You also want to make sure that the variable name is a single word or maybe even a simple combination of words. So your column for age just says age. Or maybe you're doing some intersection of variables like race and ethnicity, and you might have it named race ethnicity, and it's all one word as a combination to say that this column is the intersection of both race and ethnicity for our clients. If you have a variable that has numbers as part of the name, that's okay, but make sure that you are ideally incorporating them into a single word. So maybe you have a survey that has multiple answer options. So maybe you're using the meaning in life questionnaire, and you want each column to represent one question within the meaning in life questionnaire. So you might have MLQ1, MLQ2, MLQ3. And each of those represent questions 1, 2, and 3 respectively. So the numbers that you're using correspond ideally to the way that they appear in the data set. And also, you want to make sure that all your variable names are really short. You don't want to exceed 30 to 40 characters. I would say in general, a good rule of thumb is you want to stay below 10 characters in a variable name. Most ideally, a lot of your character names are going to be, or your variable names are going to be around like 4 to 5 letters long. Just sort of depends on what you're researching. And then finally, once you've got all of these variable names, a key thing that you need to develop is your code book. Your code book is the key to the codes in the study and how they correlate with participant responses. You want to make sure that you're keeping your code book in a secure, separate file so that it is safe from being edited, from being corrupted by a computer failing. You want to have it backed up, because if you lose the code book, you might never know what your answers respond to. And you also want to keep as much detail as possible about the coding process, such as the original coding decisions and the reasoning behind them, so that if something happens, you know why you made the decisions that you did. So here is a brief example of what a code book might look like. So in column A, you see the concept or the general category of questions. Column B is a list for each variable. So in column B, you'll see the variable names. And as you can see in this particular example, each of these variable names are pretty short. They are mostly just words or maybe even a letter with a number to correspond with a particular survey. Then column C gives you a meaning or a reason why you've chose that option or what the question is being asked. And then column D is your notation of what that means. So your answer options and what 1 represents, what 2 represents, and what 3 represents in each of those rows of what will end up being columns of data in your code book, but in your code or in your spreadsheet, but in your code book, it is represented by rows. So this is an example of a code book. And again, I just wanted to present this information to y'all so that if you do go into data and data entry and research, you have some good standards to go off of in your own work. And that is going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 9. I will see you all in the next lecture.